The night my husband died, the funeral director called me at midnight and told me not to tell our children, because I might be in danger. I can still hear Robert Morrison's voice on the line, low and careful, like he was trying to tuck my grief into a drawer where it wouldn't make a sound. He said it twice, as if repetition could make it truer. Please don't tell your kids. Not yet. They need to hear this another way. His breath sounded like the fluorescent hum of the embalming room behind him. I remember thinking, in the first stunned minutes, that it was a mistake, that I was half asleep and imagining things, that grief made strangers sound conspiratorial. I was not imagining it. 3 days after James collapsed in our living room and a coroner wrote massive heart attack, I was still wearing the same gray sweater when Robert asked me to come down to the funeral home. He said he needed to show me something he'd found during the preparations. I remember how small the lobby seemed, the thin pool of light over the reception desk, the smell of lilies and coffee, the way the tile under my shoes was cold enough to make my knees ache. The parlor was quiet in that unnatural way where everything sounds like someone else is breathing. When he set the evidence bag on the counter, my hands began to shake on their own. He lifted the edge of the bag, and there it was, a corner of dark fabric that had been stitched oddly, an unsewn pocket. Robert explained with a mumbled apology that sometimes, to be thorough, they checked clothing for keepsakes or notes. He said he didn't expect to find anything of consequence. Then he pulled out a small, crinkled envelope and a compact digital recorder the size of a deck of cards. I thought of all the small, ordinary things James used to carry, receipts from hardware stores, a lint roller, the cheap silver lighter that his sister had given him, and I tried to breathe like that would steady me. The recorder had a faint smear of dry powder at one corner. Nothing telltale, nothing dramatic. What hit me harder than the object was the look on Robert's face. He looked like someone who'd heard a whisper and suddenly realized he was standing in the middle of a public market. "Don't tell your kids," he repeated. "Not until you've had someone listen to this. God, Eleanor, I can't tell you what's on it over the phone." The line between my life before and my life after shredded in the space of that minute. 3 days earlier, I had been James's wife, the woman who ironed his shirts, the one who knew where he kept the belts, the one who rolled her eyes with him at the grocery aisle jokes. 3 days later, I was a stranger to my own home, the owner of a small, cheap recorder that, Robert insisted, might change everything about who I thought my children were. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments and consider subscribing. If this story reaches anyone who has been touched by family betrayal, please know you're not alone. The funeral, the wake, those rituals that are supposed to anchor you in community, felt like a procession on borrowed time. People said the right things in the right tones. He was a good man. We'll miss him. If there's anything... And then they clutched my hands, as though that simple human pressure could stitch me back together. David moved through the room like a man born to hold uncomfortable silences with authority. His suit was perfect, as always, his posture pristine. He'd been an aggressive, efficient presence in our lives for years, the son who could make a knot untie itself simply by giving it orders. Sarah, on the other hand, hovered. The nurse part of her never quite clocked out. She flitted through trays of cookies and tissue boxes with the same calm ministrations she offered patients. Eyes soft with what I assumed was genuine sorrow, friends handed me casseroles and condolences. Neighbors tried to explain how death had a way of making the sun feel thinner. James's old colleagues at the plant came and told the stories that made people laugh with the same chuckle they might lend to an old photograph. Those vignettes kept the world plausible for a few hours. They were a rope I could cling to while the fog of disbelief rolled through me. The recorder sat wrapped in paper in my nightstand for the first day. I kept touching the envelope James had supposedly tucked into his shirt. The handwriting on the outside was James's, a firm, looping hand that had always labeled our grocery lists and sticky notes, and his note read, in the way he always wrote to make things practical, "Eleanor, if anything happens to me, listen to the recording and call Ray Martinez. Trust me." That was the other thing that didn't fit. James had not been a conspiratorial man. He was cautious, meticulous, the kind of person who balanced a checkbook with reverence and who would never have indulged in paranoia. But he'd been an investigator for a long stretch of his life, long before the plant, long before retirement. He had a stubborn streak that kept him reading small print contracts and asking questions people found inconvenient. I almost didn't call. Grief has a way of convincing you that what you're being asked to do is impossible, like pointing at a cracked window and asking someone to fix the sky. But the thought of James leaving me specific instructions felt like a rope thrown across a chasm. I unwrapped the recorder with hands that still remembered how to button his shirts. The envelope tumbled out, a brief typed note with a few lines in his own hand. It said, "Listen, call Ray. I don't want you to see what he found without somebody who knows how to handle it. Don't trust the kids, if you can help it. I am so sorry. Don't trust the kids." The sentence sat on the paper like a bruise. My first awful reflexive thought was that James and I had been having trouble. Money worries, small sneers, disagreements about renovations and grandchildren. We had, like so many couples, patience for each other that sometimes calcified into assumptions. But I couldn't conjure the kind of thing that makes a father plot to murder his own family, and my mind balked as if faced with an impossible jigsaw piece. I called Ray Martinez the next morning because James had asked me to. When the detective answered the phone, he sounded like someone who had been awake for longer than was decent. He had the dry cadence of a man used to bad news, but still capable of being direct with kindness. I told him, almost in a whisper, that the funeral director had found something, that James had left a note, that I was scared. "If James asked you to call me," Ray said without hesitating, "then you did the right thing." We met at a diner because the diner gives grief a place to be ordinary. The coffee there was burned and honest, the neon sign buzzed like an old radio, and Ray ordered eggs with the same efficiency he used in a police report. He listened to me before I listened to him. He let me tell the parts I needed to tell. James's sudden collapse, the funeral, the people who had come by to look serious. There was grief in my voice, an ache that had nothing to do with the facts, and he let that stand without trying to polish it. When I told him about the recorder, his jaw folded into something like attention. He took the recorder between two fingers and said, "Let me hear it." We put the tiny device on the table between us and Ray hit play. It was the low, insistent kind of recording that made my stomach hollow. Voices that were very close, private voices, David's controlled and quiet, making plans like he was drafting a contract. Sarah's, softer in tone, but threaded with the same cruel calculation, filled the diner booth with a light that felt like a strip search. "I can make it look like a heart attack," David was saying, clear as if he were at the kitchen table. "Mom isn't hard to. She takes pills. A few pills, a little mix, and it's simple. We get the policy and pay the debts." Sarah's voice was even then the one that made me want to throw up. "We do it for the money, David. We split it. For the kids. For the future. We—" Her words clipped, sharpened, too casual for the thing they described. Hearing them say those sentences out loud was like watching the wallpaper peel off a wall you thought was steady. The names on the device were the same names that sat at my dining table each Sunday. They were the children I had raised to say please and thank you. The voices belonged to those same hands that had held me up when a storm took the electricity out of my confidence. Yet the recorder made those voices into something alien. They planned how to make death look natural. They talked about life insurance. They talked about who would lie and who would grieve on command. When I pulled the recorder away from the table, The diner felt suddenly communal and dangerous in a new way. Ray's face had gone private, a detective's expression, neatly folded into analysis. "You didn't find this in his pocket by accident," he said. "James found something. He must have come upon evidence that scared him. He recorded it, and he wanted you to know." I told him about the envelope. He asked to see the note. He read it quickly, then sat back, the paper trembling in his fingers. "This is why he reached out," he said softly. "He wanted someone who could take it seriously. There's a curious, cruel economy to confirmation. When someone you love has a fear and you find the proof, grief has the perverse effect of being both devastating and vindicating. The proof makes their dread real, sure, but it also makes the world a darker place. I felt both, the particular sharpness of betrayal like a clean cut, and the dull, spreading bruise of grief. Ray didn't jump to action as a cop in a movie would. He did what a careful detective does. He documented, he preserved, he said things like chain of custody and we'll need to get copies without offering me the kind of assurances that cure the night. He recommended we get the recorder to the station and get a formal copy made. He asked if I felt safe staying at home. He was gentle, but there was the implied line. You cannot be naive about the people closest to you. I went back to our house that day with a hollow in my chest the size of an oven. The rooms felt like parts of a life I'd been handed back without instruction. James's slippers were by the chair. His glasses lay on the end table, lenses smudged where he'd set them down after reading late. I noticed, with all the small, idiot reverence of the grieving, that the newspaper he read had the classifieds folded 3 times, like it always had. I had intended to do nothing formal for a while. Wait, breathe, keep my days small. But life has a way of being practical, and practical things intruded on sentiment. I had a pot of coffee, black, exactly how James liked it, and a baked good from the funeral home sitting on the counter. When you're used to making coffee for 2, the simple act becomes a ritual you perform by muscle memory. I poured a cup, sat down at the table, and absent-mindedly popped a few pills from a small bottle into my hand. They were the sleeping pills my doctor had prescribed for my restless nights. I'd been taking them for weeks with no trouble. I didn't notice the taste at first. It blended into the coffee, a tiny chemical afternote that should not have been there. My hands went cold. A film of sweat rose on my temple like a small, dark cloud. I looked for the bottle I'd taken them from. Only then did I see, on the counter by the sink, another small bottle with no label, a smear where a cap had been roughly turned. The rational part of me, the part that had paid bills and balanced the garden mortgage, sprang and began checking things. Which bottle had I used? Where did that one come from? How did it get there? It is a strange, bone-deep thing to realize someone is trying to make you disappear. It seizes your throat with a soundless gasp and makes your mind race as if you've been shoved off a cliff and haven't yet learned how to breathe in the new air. I called Ray. I told him in a short, clipped voice that a stranger bottle had been on my counter. He told me to not take anything else, to put the bottle in a zip bag, not to touch anything else, and to get to a hospital. He also told me, with the blunt practicality of a man who has seen how quickly situations can get worse, that I should not be alone for now. I told him I wanted to go to my sister Ruth's. She lived on the other side of town, the kind of sister who kept pickled cucumbers in the fridge and always left a lamp on in the hall because she preferred light to worry. Ruth will make sense of all of this, I said, meaning the decimals and the paperwork and the people who did not know how to disguise cruelty. Ray agreed. He asked how soon I could leave. I said I could get packed. He said he would be there. I packed slow things, James's sweater, a dress for the funeral we'd held, a photo album with the edges soft as if we'd rubbed them a lot. I packed in a hurry the way someone weighs good memories against bad ones and decides to take the ones that don't stab. I left the rest. The house was a capsule that pulsed with our history, and I could not wrestle it into a suitcase. We left with the recorder in a brown envelope and a bag with a few toothbrushes. Detective Ray drove. He was quiet, but not grim. There was a steady hum in his silence, like a car on cruise control. He kept an eye on the rear-view mirror more than was natural for a man taking a quiet, middle-aged woman to her sister's house. At one point, he turned to me and said softly, "They'll try to move things. They don't want anyone reading what James found." On the highway, with the radio a low presence and the streetlights slicing silver across the dashboard, we noticed a black BMW that seemed to keep our pace. It stayed a respectful, persistent gap behind us for several miles. I remember the odd, incandescent panic of that moment, the very ordinary geometry of a car tailing us, and the immediate animal sense that we were being observed. Ray's hand tightened on the wheel. He drove like someone who had been preparing all his life for moments that required a cool head. He signaled to a patrol colleague, and the BMW eased off a few exits later, slipping away the way shadows do when someone shines a light on them. We reached Ruth's, and the house smelled of lemon and dust, a tidy domesticity that felt like a prayer. My sister opened the door like a woman who had always known grief might come knocking on the other's threshold. She wrapped her arms around me like the old, small, neighborly kindnesses of childhood, firm, perfunctory, unembarrassed. That night, in Ruth's spare room, I slept in clothes, and the television hummed as if it were a soft animal guarding the house. I woke in the dark, with the memory of the recorder heavy in my mind, and the taste of someone else's intent in my mouth. The next day, we met Ray at his office to make a formal statement. He brought in a woman from forensics to handle the device. He did not dramatize anything for me. He documented, he took photographs. He listened to the little parts of my truth without flinching. He said the words, money laundering, prescription theft, and alleged tampering with patients, with the clinical distance of someone naming inventory at a warehouse. Each word unclenched my fists a little and then clenched my stomach. "You're not imagining things," Ray said when he felt me wobble. "But we need to protect you, Eleanor. For now, keep the recorder with us. Let us copy it and see what else we can find." There were other things he told me that afternoon that sounded like the teeth of a key being tested in a lock. That James had likely been onto something bigger than just family greed. That elderly patients had gone missing prescriptions, and that ledgers had gaps. That sometimes families covered for one another in ways that looked like devotion until you saw the numbers. That there were others, neighbors, nurses, an accountant, who had complained in whispers. Each of those phrases layered on the other until the map of my life looked like a place I had no GPS for. When I told Ruth, she cried not for my safety alone, but for the stolen naivete that looked at children as angels until someone peeled back a curtain and all you found was business practice. "Who do you call?" she asked me, holding my hands like an anchor. "When your children become strangers, the thing about betrayal is its particular loneliness." My friends at church called and left halting messages. Some avoided telling me details, thinking perhaps that silence would be kinder than the truth. David called and spoke in the clipped, careful way lawyers adopt when they're trying to be calm to the public. "Mom," he said, "we need to be careful. This is all very sensitive. You know I'm handling everything, right?" His voice had an edge that made me imagine a folder full of neat notes and a calendar of legal dates. "David," I said slowly, because there is a way of saying someone's name when you are trying to balance a memory with a new, terrible data point. Did you... I couldn't finish. The syllables hung like laundry between us. There are moments when the world insists on being practical, even when your own insides are collapsing. Ray asked whether I had seen my pills lately. He asked whether Sarah had helped with meals recently. He asked carefully if anyone had access to James's prescriptions. I answered with the kinds of facts that sound absurd. Sarah had once taken extra shifts at the clinic. David had occasionally handled large sums of money for us when we were doing renovations. Each innocuous sentence felt suddenly like a ticket in a ledger. I spent that night awake, as so many people in my position do, running through scenes and trying to plug gaps. I went back in my mind to the way James had been in his last days. Distracted sometimes, insistent on checking documents, reading emails with the same gravity he used to read the classifieds. I remembered him one afternoon at the kitchen table, phone to his ear, looking at a folder with a frown he rarely allowed himself when the mortgage was due or the leaky roof demanded attention. He'd said nothing then, only frowned and turned a page. I had thought it was just the small indignities of paperwork, of age, of a man who liked order. At 2 a.m, I started to hear things. Little noises in Ruth's house that were probably the settling of a house or the refrigerator's sigh. I turned on the lamp and found Ray sitting at the foot of the bed, dossier open like a talisman. He had coffee that had gone cold. He was not there as a dramatic protector. He was there because the kind of person he was could not leave a woman who had requested his help in the lurch. There were calls on James's phone, he said quietly, showing me the list. Calls and texts to numbers we're tracing. There was also an email account. He was forwarding things to a secure address. He was cautious. He left instructions because he was worried. The rational part of me still tried to file everything into neat categories. The detective part, the part of me that had once worked with James trying to make sense of a spreadsheet or a ledger, tried to see motive. Debt, he suggested, was a powerful motivator. We had nudged along by a modest pension and the mortgage, and lately there had been talk in the family about how to best redistribute assets. But there is a leap between arguing over an estate and planning an elder's death. The recorded voices had bridged that impossibly obscene distance. That same night, while Ruth brewed chamomile like someone who believed in old remedies, I heard a tremor at the door, an ordinary noise that laced the familiar with threat. I went to the window and saw a shape parked across the road, a car with its light off, silhouette low as a predatory animal. My heart hammered like a frightened bird. Ray came in then, the room lit by the hall lamp, and told me to stay put. He said the car had been noted by a patrol officer and that they were keeping an eye. He told me to leave the curtains closed and to let Ruth do the talking at the sink. He told me, without melodrama, that sometimes the people we love most are the ones who hurt us. That phrase settled into me like an ache. I lay awake thinking about James's hands, the way they'd smoothed my hair, the way he'd held my face on our anniversary, and I thought about how hands could be the instruments of both tenderness and calculation. Somewhere in the house that night, in rooms I had once walked through without concern, someone had made a ledger of our lives. In the morning, the sun came with the same bland face as ever. Ruth made me tea and handed me a plate with toast. In the kitchen, she hummed under her breath, that uncomplaining tune that families sing to themselves when they are trying to keep rhythms. The small domesticity calmed me, the toast, the tea, the hum, but beneath that calm was the recorder, now safely in police custody, and information that forced me to be someone I had never wanted to be. Cautious, watchful, a woman cataloging what had once been a life as though it were a crime scene. Later that morning, Ray called and said they had made a preliminary copy of the recording. There were more voices on it than just David and Sarah, others mentioned in passing whose names we were to trace. Nurses, accountants, people who had given access to medications under the guise of care. He used the word pattern, as detectives do, and there was something both reassuring and bleak about that. That grief could be put into categories and tracked like some kind of beast. We were careful then, in a new way. I canceled appointments. I told a few close friends. We changed the locks, something that felt both symbolic and necessary. and had a police cruiser stay within a block of Ruth's house for shifts. But practical measures did little to quell the noise in my skull. When Sarah called, she sounded like an actress practicing grief. "Mom," she said, "we just want to protect you. This is all so unfair." Her tone was that same cultivated softness, the voice of someone trained to seem soothing. I listened, and something in me recoiled. Not because it sounded false, but because it was a voice I now could no longer fully translate. I thought of James at the kitchen table, frowning over documents, leaving a note that said, "Call Ray." I thought of the recorder. I thought of my children's voices on that tiny, ordinary device. There are moments in life when the shoes you stand in change shape under your feet. On the same day, I began moving into a mode of protection, short answers to calls, police presence, a copy of the recording at the precinct. I felt another change. It was a small, stubborn thing, a part of me that refused to be erased, that wanted to understand. That grain of sturdiness was James's legacy, as much as anything else he had left me. He had prepared, he had documented, he had made, however quietly, a way for me to see. And so, holding my coffee too hot and my hands too steady, I agreed to meet Ray later that afternoon to go over the next steps. We were to extract what we could from James's files, to inventory accounts, and to consider the possibility that the people who had loved me the longest might be involved in something that could destroy us. It was a thin thread, tighter than I liked, but it felt better than not knowing. We drove back toward the precinct with the windows up and the neighborhood unspooling like a memory. Behind us, for a time, there was silence. Then, like a shadow resuming its place, the BMW slipped back into our lane. The glint of its chrome was like a threat that had learned to whisper. The streetlights blurred into a steady line, and I felt the world tilt in the way it does when you discover a portrait of someone you loved with someone else's hands all over it. Ray didn't speak, but I could see him measure the distance between us and that car, with the same care he used to measure evidence. The choice in my body was immediate and small, to be brave or to be clever. In that tight moment, both felt like luxuries. We took the next exit. The BMW did not. The air in the car was heavy and wet with all the things we were not yet ready to name out loud. The streetlights blurred into a steady line, and I felt the world tilt in the way it does when you discover a portrait of someone you loved with someone else's hands all over it. Ray didn't speak. He watched the space between our car and the BMW as if measuring the width of a thread. For a moment I let myself be both frightened and absurdly proud. Frightened because the people who should have been safe were not. Proud because James had planned ahead enough to leave me a rope. The BMW tailed us for a long while longer, patient as a shadow. Ray signaled again, then eased our route into a police precinct parking lot that smelled faintly of old coffee and cleaner. There were men in uniform then, silent, efficient, and one of them slid out and walked the BMW while Ray and I stayed inside. The officer returned with the same flat expression that someone gets after they've seen the mechanics of human cruelty. The car belonged to a registered vehicle in David's name. It had a plate, we knew. It had been following us in a way that left no question. That was the moment the slow architecture of what James had discovered tightened into a frame I could see the edges of. It was no longer an abstract worry. It was a plot with names and routes and a shadow car on the road. Ray called for copies of the preliminary forensic report, took our statements, and set up a protective detail to rotate through Ruth's street. He told me gently, but with the steadiness of someone who had little patience for theatrics, that we were now in a different kind of week. We would live by new rules for a while. I would not be alone. In the days that followed, the police work crept forward in the unglamorous way of real investigations. Hours of sorting emails, matching bank transfers to invoices that didn't exist, tracing the doctors who had written prescriptions and asking uncomfortable questions about how many pills vanished between the pharmacy and the bedside. Detectives I'd never met showed me spreadsheets that made my palms sweat. Accountants tutored me in ledgers that looked like someone had turned family devotion into a balance sheet. Names that had once been only gossip, nurses who'd been too casual with medications, businessmen with quick answers, began to line up on paper like a procession. Ray was careful to separate what he knew from what he was still confirming. He told me the names they traced were connected to money that had flowed out of accounts belonging to elderly patients. He told me the pieces they had weren't just about greed, they were about access and the willingness to use it. It's a pattern, he said. Not every odd bill proves a crime, but the pattern builds a case. He arranged for me to make a statement to the district attorney's office. They took my words and the recorder and promised to build what they could. I learned in those meetings that police and district attorneys move like people balancing the scales, carefully, legally, with a nervousness for evidence chains and a reverence for procedures. I learned that James had been meticulous enough to understand that when you push against something this close, you need a paper trail, and then the family pushed back. For reasons I would inspect later in court, David and Sarah went public with a tidy little narrative. They painted James as forgetful in his last months, implied that the stress of grief was bending my truth, and suggested that anyone could have accessed James's pockets in the confusion after his death. It was the most practiced sort of arrogance. Lawyers have a way of making what they want to be true feel inevitable. They also moved on the house. While I was sleeping at Ruth's, they filed paperwork that suggested a transfer of estate to expedite legal handling and listed certain accounts as temporarily frozen pending probate or some similarly procedural-sounding phrase. Paper can be used like a song to soothe until it's a lock. They were efficient. They were smooth. Their actions felt like instruments being played in a piece I had not been invited to conduct. On the fourth day after James's funeral, Ruth Street became a landscape I recognized only from movies and from the edges of other people's lives. It began with a call to that same police line Ray had set up for us. A neighbor, confused and wide-eyed, said there was a package left on the curb of Ruth's house at dusk. It looked ordinary, like a misplaced vase or a misdelivered catalog, only it hummed low like something miswired. The man who answered told me it might be nothing, that often people set things down and forget them. But patrol officers do not like to guess with objects that hum where people live. The county bomb squad came, the men who do a job few people ever imagine until they are forced to learn the vocabulary of possibility. They told the family to step back, to clear the lane, to hold on to the facts and not the fear. We watched from the safety of a police cruiser as technicians went about the grim work of determining whether the object posed a real risk. I will not describe the methods they used. That is not for me to explain, but I will say what they left behind. An atmosphere that smelled vaguely of ozone and anxiety, officers moving with a rhythm that felt both ritual and mechanical, neighbors clustered on the curb with their faces arranged like prayer. The device, as it was later called in police reports, was determined to be live. That word sat in my ears like a bell. There was a controlled evacuation of the immediate street. Ruth's house felt suddenly small and intruded upon, our belongings refuge and evidence at the same time. The news vans, always hungry for a frame that fits their maze of angles, came and parked like vultures in the next block. But the police kept them back and moved with a discipline I had come to trust. The device was neutralized at a safe distance. No one was hurt in that operation. It felt like a miracle of procedures and luck, and I allowed myself to breathe in gratitude for that sliver of normality. The bomb threat changed everything. It was no longer an allegation that could be debated by legal arguments over dinner. It was a direct attempt to terrorize people we loved. the DA's office convened in an emergency session, and the county assigned resources. The FBI, at my later knowledge, and with the discretion their agencies use, opened a liaison because the cross-jurisdictional nature of the activities, bank transfers, interstate communications, required a larger net. I had mixed feelings about more agents. Relief, because trained people were watching this widen into a pattern. Discomfort, because now the world was filling out with uniforms and bureaucratic scripts. In the days after the device was found, tensions in my family calcified. Sarah began to appear at Ruth's in the afternoons under the guise of checking on me, delivering casseroles with a hand that trembled and a voice that tried too hard to sound steady. Once, she brought a tall thermos of coffee and insisted I have some. "Just to keep your strength up," she said, as if she were a nurse on a shift. It was the same gesture she'd made for other patients, comfort in a cup. I took a small sip and tasted only bitter coffee. Something in me recoiled from the intimacy of that cup. I glanced at the thermos and noticed a faint smell I could not name. My stomach dropped in a way that felt familiar. Not the old grief, but the cold recognition that people sometimes use small offerings to deliver harm. I did the practical thing then, because the practical had become a lifeline. I filmed the cup with my phone and handed it discreetly to Ray. He took it with no drama and promised it would be analyzed. Sarah, when questioned later in court, said she had been making coffee for her mother in the way of daughters. Her voice had the same careful softness that had made the recorder so poisonous. The day of the siege was a long, terrible escalation smeared across late afternoon into night. Ray had warned us to expect retaliation as a possibility. He had not wished it upon anyone. But once the bomb threat had been confirmed, the police knew they needed to do more than wait. They advised that Ruth's house should be a controlled site for evidence preservation and that our movement must be limited. They stationed officers in the yard and on the block. They advised neighbors to stay inside. Sometime around dusk, the power in the neighborhood went out. It was the kind of darkness that makes familiar rooms feel like places where a person could be made invisible. I remember Ruth lighting candles by habit. She always had a soft devotion to small flames. And I remember the phone lines being useless and the batteries in flashlights feeling like small, precious things. The officers moved like slow swimmers, cautious and deliberate. There was a low, steady hum of radios and men speaking in clipped phrases. I tried at first not to hear clearly. We sat in compartments of the house that felt both like shelter and cell. Then Sarah came. She walked through the side door as though she belonged there, because she did. Her eyes were wide, but there was a glass in them I had seen before, the glass of someone who had convinced herself that the line between right and necessity can be blurred by a good argument. She carried a small syringe in her hand. It gleamed faintly in the candlelight. "I'm not here to hurt you, Mom," she said, and the sentence was a strange braid of pleading and accusation. I remembered the movement of the room in fractions. Ruth's fingers tightening on the back of an armchair, an officer in the hallway opening his mouth and then closing it as Sarah's gait slowed. My own hands went to my chest because the thing in my body that had been used to feel safety now mapped risk with every beat. "Sarah," I said, the name an attempt to anchor something I had known in a life that seemed further away with every breath. "What are you doing?" She slid onto the arm of an old sofa like a person trying to make crisis feel like conversation. "They're saying things," she said, and for a second her voice softened. "They're saying it's all about money, Mom, but—" Her sentence broke. "You brought that here?" Ruth asked, flat and furious. My sister is not given to performative outrage. When she is angry, it is like a black pepper thrown in soup, effective and exact. Sarah's answer was a confession and a justification at once. She told us, in clipped, gasping sentences, about the pressure David had been under, about debts she'd helped him cover, about how fear tightened the chest and made small crimes feel like survival. She tried in that moment to make it understandable. But understanding is not the same as acceptance. The syringe, in the way only small instruments can be, felt obscene in a living room. Police moved then in a choreography that had been practiced in other houses, in other stories. An officer gently but firmly instructed Sarah to put the syringe down and make a space between her hands and hers. Sarah hesitated. I think she was trying to reconcile whatever story she had told herself about necessity with the bright, uncompromising fact that a syringe in a house with an elderly woman is a kind of threat that makes it impossible to be charitable. She lunged, not with the precision of a trained attacker, but with the ferocity of someone who thinks she has no other options. I remember the glitter of movement, the shout that cut the air, the flash of a uniform, the sound of a body hitting a chair. I remember, above all, the surreal vertigo of hearing a single gunshot. Sarah fell with an expression on her face that was not altogether hatred. There was shock there, a kind of pale astonishment that the world could be broken so fast. Officers pulled her to the carpet and handcuffed her. An ambulance was called. She was taken with a blanket over her legs, chemical blue and clinical, but the blue could not hide the fact that this was my daughter. Watching her being loaded into a vehicle felt like watching a portrait being taken down from a wall. For all the harm and terror in the days leading up to that moment, I felt in that instant only an enormous ballistic grief. I would not burst into theatrical forgiveness. No, the moment was too sharp and complicated. But seeing her on a stretcher, eyes wide and bewildered, there was a part of me that only knew I had raised a being who had once sung off-key lullabies into the night and held my hand in the dentist's waiting room. The mind does not shut down historical tenderness because of present horror. Meanwhile, across the street, a car idled with a man in it, his hands on something delicate and dangerous. David sat in his BMW calm as someone waiting for a cue. He had learned the art of neatness so well that even his threats felt like legal motions in which he had practiced every phrase. Officers moved with a simulation of caution. The FBI liaison had taken command of the traffic barrier and worked with local tactical teams. They had reason to suspect David might try something definitive. I cannot ascribe precise mechanics to his device. What I can say is that men who had trained for the least likely scenarios prevented a worse case. They foiled him by means both technical and human, and then they moved in. When they arrested him, he was taken from the car with a kind of resigned composure that suggested he felt himself above panic. He was placed in custody and read his rights. He looked at me as they led him away. There was no warmth in his gaze. There was instead the same professional neatness he used when negotiating our mortgage. For a moment our eyes met, and I thought I saw, in his expression, the last, bright, lonely curl of someone who had been asked to stand for everything he valued and had chosen profit. Both children were taken to the precinct. Both were charged with multiple counts. The details, the counts, the precise language of the indictments are letters on paper that add up to guilt in a courtroom. The press called it a family tragedy. I called it a legal reckoning that had been a long time coming. The evidence James had left, the recordings, the notes, the ledgers, became the backbone of the prosecution's case. When the DA's office announced charges, I felt a slow, complex relief. Justice is not the same as healing, but it is the architecture around which healing can begin. Pretrial was a months-long exercise in papers and hearings. David's team pushed and pushed for motions to suppress evidence, to argue that the recorder had been mishandled, that grief can make people unreliable witnesses, that we had been hasty. The defense lawyers are masters of a small art. They can make doubt live like a shadow that never leaves a room. But the prosecution had its own architecture of proof. The copies of the recording, the witnesses, nurses who testified about missing medications. accountants who could point to transfers that matched no invoice, neighbors who described suspicious nighttime trips to our house, joined with James's own provisions that he'd been cautious and afraid. When the trial began, I sat in a courtroom that smelled of wood polish and human anxiety. People I had once waved to at the grocery store sat in rows of seats. Some watched with faces like masks, others with a more visible sorrow. The prosecutor played portions of James's recording that were surgical in their clarity, humiliating evidence of a plan we had never imagined. They played snippets of conversations where names were used like checkboxes: insurance, policy, who would move funds, who would lie about medicines. The sound of my children's voices coming from a speaker made my breath a small mechanical thing. I felt as if I were being asked to forgive and to testify simultaneously. The DA, in arguments that were careful and humane, asked the jury to consider patterns of behavior that suggested premeditation. The defense pushed back, arguing for the complexity of family dynamics, for the possibility of misinterpretation, for grief's cloud. The legal dance went on with an intensity I had never known existed in such places. I remember the day they played James's last recording for the courtroom. The prosecutor had held it back as the emotional fulcrum. When it came on, the sound that filled the room felt like a small private thunder. James's voice, steady, older, a little rough where age had softened but not lessened him, spoke directly to me. His words were short and practical, the way he had always been when he wanted to be clear. He said plainly, "Eleanor, if anything happens, listen to this. Don't let them take your life. Live well. Love again. Be brave." Those sentences landed on me like something both warm and terrible. I heard the little catches in the voice I had known for 40 years. I felt the weight of that instruction like a compass. In that courtroom, surrounded by strangers who had become witnesses to our private dismantling, I felt both the rawness of betrayal and the delicate, stubborn thread of love. James's voice asked me to survive in the most faithful, human way, to not let their choices finish my story. The jury listened, the room held its breath, and then ordinary legal work resumed. Witnesses testified about ledgers. Forensic pharmacists described pills and supply chains. Officers outlined the moments of the siege. David's defense painted a different portrait, but when it came to the recording and the pattern of deposits and withdrawals, the evidence fit together. When the verdict came, the courtroom felt like an organism that had been holding a secret through weeks of testimony and finally released it. The jury found both David and Sarah guilty on multiple counts: conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and other charges that the law sets for those who use trust as a weapon. The judge pronounced sentences that were significant and meant to be punitive and prevent future harm. They were taken to separate facilities. The world would not let them walk into their tidy lives unmarked. When the judge pronounced the sentences, I felt an odd mixture: relief, which was a soft, small thing, sorrow for the children who had become legal names, and a strange, new sense of permission to grieve without having to be consumed by the specific question of why. The law had spoken in its blunt, procedural way. It did not heal. It imposed consequence. In the months after the verdict, life felt provisional. The house that James and I had built with ordinary mornings and Sunday dinners now felt like a place that had once been both a sanctuary and a ledger. I went back to it for a while, to sort papers, to speak with lawyers and accountants who could explain what had been taken and what remained. I learned, painfully, the kind of resilience that is not theatrical, the small, daily insistence of making coffee for one and then for no one, of watering a fern, of sending a thank you note. People wrote to me in those months, old friends, neighbors, women from the church, saying simply, "We are sorry," and offering casseroles and company. Others offered invitations to speak about elder rights and victim advocacy. A woman from the Victim Rights Coalition reached out to me after the trial, soft and professional. She said she had read the transcripts, listened to the recording, and thought my experience could be built into something that might help others avoid what had happened to us. I was unsure at first. I had spent months in an odd trench of survival and suspicion, of trying to keep the world neutral while making decisions that would keep me safe. But helping others felt less like a duty and more like an offering James himself might have admired, turning something private and tragic into something public and protective. I traveled slowly, first to the coast with Ruth, where wind scoured the sameness of grief into something that felt like air. Later, with the thin permission that comes when you have completed the chores of a legal aftermath, I booked a plane to Paris. I had always loved the city from afar, the idea of cafes and walks and the small civic rituals of people who take time to look at buildings. I did not go for romance, because romance felt impossible after the weeks of betrayal. I went to remind myself that the world held beauty that was not transactional. Paris was a salve. I walked along the Seine, watching couples that were simply people sharing a bench, lovers and strangers indistinguishable in their ordinariness. I ate bread in the morning that was warm and plain and good. I let myself be surprised by a small, kind act from a woman at a bakery who wrapped my baguette with the same care she would give a friend. Those small domestic moments reminded me who I had been before the recorder, before the trial, before the gunshot. They reminded me that life could be simple again, that the capacity to be astonished by light and bread and small courtesies is one of the ways we keep ourselves whole. Back home, I began to meet with a small group through the Victim Rights Coalition. We sat in rooms with coffee and chairs that creaked and told stories. Some of the people had been through public scandals. Others had been quietly harmed by abuse of access. I found in those meetings a strange redemption. People who would bear witness so that others could have the thin armor of knowledge. I began to speak, at first in small circles, and then at broader gatherings, about the necessity of documentation, of checking ledgers, of being suspicious of an answer's neatness. I did not position myself as an expert. I positioned myself as a woman who had been betrayed and had decided to be useful with the fragments she had. There's a funny, private thing that happened over and over in those months. People would tell me, with the best intentions, how inspirational it was to see me walking in the park or holding a coffee. They often confounded the difference between inspiration and ordinary stubbornness. I would smile and tell them something James had said in the kitchen years before. You can be stubborn in a dignified way. He meant that you could insist on small courtesies for yourself. The phrase guided me. It is possible to be stubborn and modest at the same time. The contact from the Victim Rights Coalition led me eventually to write a short piece for a regional paper about elder abuse and the ways in which families can be sites of both tenderness and danger. That essay was not an explosion. It was a simple thing about reading the fine print. People responded with notes and phone calls. Some told me their own stories. Some sent thanks. One woman, a nurse in a nearby county, called and said she had started a small project at her clinic to inventory medication access more carefully. It was the soft reward of change, the memory of the gunshot, of the way my daughter looked in the hospital, of the way my son's face had been blank as a ledger as they took him away. It did not fade. Memory is not a thing that dissolves because a verdict is written. It becomes a landscape you live inside, with paths you can choose to walk down or avoid. I learned to move through that landscape with less catastrophic expectation. I would not say I forgave. I'm not sure forgiveness is the right word. But I learned to understand that the people who hurt you are also people who have been damaged, and that understanding does not obligate mercy. It asks, at best, for sober clarity. One of the hardest parts of the aftermath was the way people wanted simple endings. They wanted catharsis. They wanted a tidy movie that concluded with redemption or ruin. Life rarely offers that. What happened to us was a legal ending. Convictions and sentences and the particular shape of consequences. But there was no miraculous healing. There was, instead, a daily rebuilding, making new plans, finding new friends, traveling to see a city where the light falls differently, and sitting in rooms where people say, "I was harmed," and are heard. On the anniversaries, I do small things. I plant a bulb in the spring, and I buy too many lilies in the summer. I keep James's glasses in a little box, and sometimes take them out and think about the sound of his voice. Sometimes I listen to the original recording, not the full thing, only the parts the court allowed me to have, and I feel again the terrible clarity of betrayal. But I also feel the steadiness of James's instruction, to live. His words echo like a gentle command. Live well, love again, be brave. He had asked me to choose life and dignity over a slow, private ruin. I try to honor him by doing just that. I do not present myself as a hero. Heroes are rare and often badly behaved. I am simply a woman who had her life broken and chose, slowly and with a lot of ordinary help, to put it back together in a different shape. I travel small distances. I take on small projects. I speak up when I'm asked. I volunteer with groups that help older adults look closely at the people who provide their care. If you are listening, wherever you are, let me say this plainly. Documents matter. Quiet signs matter. If a loved one is unusually protective about financial matters, if someone pressures you to take the easy way with prescriptions or decisions, ask questions. Courage is small and built in practical habits. Copy important documents. Know who has access to medications. Keep a trusted person in the loop. This story is not a promise that good will always win. It is instead a record that when small, patient people do the work of documentation, when husbands like James leave instructions because they suspect danger, when detectives like Ray insist on doing careful work, when neighbors call about odd packages, and when institutions like the DA and the FBI apply their tools, then justice can be pursued and harm can sometimes be stopped. The day of my husband's funeral changed everything, not because of death, which had been inevitable in a way, but because of the evidence Robert found in James's pocket. That small moment was the fulcrum. It led to fear and to violence, to a siege and to arrests. It also led, eventually, to verdicts and to a strange, new possibility. The chance to rebuild life on terms that felt like my own. If you've been touched by family betrayal or elder abuse, you are not alone. There are organizations that will listen and help. The Victim Rights Coalition reached out to me after the trial, and they were, and continue to be, a resource. If you need to talk, look for local victim services and legal aid. Speak to someone you trust. Keep records. And for reasons I cannot entirely explain, except that James asked me to, I have decided to keep living with a stubbornness he would have admired. I have learned to be brave in quiet ways, opening the curtains on a winter morning, taking a train to a city that feels alive, saying yes to invitations that used to feel too risky. I am careful, yes. I am also finally alive. If this story has reached you and you want to share it, or if you know someone who needs to hear it, please consider sharing. If you're here now, please subscribe. There will be more conversations about safety, about documentation, and about what it means to reclaim a life after betrayal. And if you've had an experience like mine, I would love to hear from you. We are not, any of us, as alone as betrayal can make us feel. Live well. Love again. Be brave.